My last video on my top 5 tips on landscape photography composition is by far my most popular video ever. So with the request of making more, here's another video with 5 top tips on landscape photography composition. So here's the first tip, and it's about how to create depth in your picture and what comes with adding such an effect. And this first picture of Scale Bear waterfall is actually a prime example of how to use a wide angle to create depth in your picture. It actually kind of feels as if you're standing right there in the river, and I was when I took this picture, because I'm using a wide angle to emphasize the foreground and make this 3D effect. It gives this very dramatic perspective where, as I said, it feels as if you're in the picture itself. So another photo from Scale Bear Falls waterfall, it's actually kind of the same, where I'm standing very close to the water using a wide angle, and I found this composition that goes through the picture. Now remember, depth in itself is not a value. You have to use depth to guide the viewer and to tell your story. Now you don't necessarily need to use an ultra wide angle to take your photo. In this case, the depth is created in the relation between the two boats here. Also, we have this S-curve going through the clouds, but it's in the relationship between these two boats that we can see that there is some kind of depth in the picture. And you can actually also use a telezoom to create depth, but it depends on what you are photographing. Now, a telezoom have a tendency to do the opposite of making a 3D effect. It makes the picture more flat. But in this case with Glen Cove, we have the foreground with the road here, which bounces off to the different mountains all the way down through the cove. And that is what creates the sense of depth in this picture. Now, if I were standing somewhat around here and took the same picture, I wouldn't get the same effect. I would need a wide angle to get the mountains within the frame, and then the foreground would be very big and the background would be very small. So I would actually argue in this case with photographing Glen Cove or any other valley, the sense of depth is often emphasized if you move further away and then use a telezoom, because then the size difference between the foreground and the background won't be as large. So you can also create depth with a telezoom. Now the thing is, when you're using a wide angle to create depth in your photo, there's a huge risk of sacrificing the sense of scale. In this case from the ferry pools, you can see how the foreground is very big, like we have a few waves and the stones here, compared to the background mountain. Like this is an entire mountain, and I've managed to create this little stream way larger than the mountain. The same goes here. We have the depth in the picture with the foreground and the middle ground with the girl standing here looking at the mountain. It was the same mountain as the one before, but the girl is really big compared to the mountain. So there's a huge risk of sacrificing the sense of scale in the picture if you use a wide angle to make your depth. And that leads me to the second tip, which is about how you can create scale in your photos. So here's the first photo from Dunyandi in Iceland, and we have Goda who stands up here, and compared to the waterfall, she is really small, and compared to the foreground waterfall, she is still very small. But now look, right here I'm actually standing relatively close to Dunyandi the waterfall compared to this one photo. Here I'm standing all the way down at the parking lot, and Goda is still standing here. And if you compare to the photo before, the waterfall is way smaller, but Goda keeps the same size in the two photos. Yet the waterfall here is way bigger than in the first photo. So I have moved away, zoomed in, and I have gotten a completely other scale in the photo. So the same goes for here, where the two people, Sophie and myself, we are close to the camera relative to the background. So we are pretty big compared to the background. Now, this is the same location, just a bit further down the hill. This is Parkhouse Hill, and here Parkhouse Hill. And you can see how small Sophie is here. That's because there's a bigger distance between Sophie and the camera than there is up here. Of course, we're also a bit closer to Parkhouse Hill, which also helps emphasizing the scale of this place. But in this photo, there are probably around 200 meters between the camera and Sophie, and then I have zoomed in. Whereas here, there are probably no more than 20 meters or something like that, and I haven't zoomed in as much as in the other picture. So this last photo is a brilliant example of how I have put the person in the background as to make the foreground look even larger, because we relate our own height to the height of the person in the background. So if it was possible for me to place the person on the C-stack over here, she would be at least twice as big, because the distance between the camera and this C-stack is only half the distance between the camera and the cliff here in the background, which would in the end make the C-stack here in the middle feel way smaller. And that's the thing about scale. We as humans, when we look at a photo, we need things to relate to in the photo which we know the scale of. So if people haven't been here before, it's kind of hard to see how big the C-stack is. But when I put a person in there, or if I could somehow put a car on top of it or a house, it would be way easier for the person to interpret how big the scene actually is. So that's the thing. If you want to show scale, you need to take the distance between the relatable object and the camera into consideration, and you need to use something which we viewers can relate to: a car, a house, a person, something like that. The third tip is break the horizon. In this case of this picture from Iceland, which is Skatklatur, it's a big C-stack, which is located at Anastapi, a small town on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula. I have put emphasis on the C-stack and not anything else. This is what I want to show in the photo. If you look at this picture from Oregon, Thorswell in Oregon, we have the horizon line here, which kind of separates the foreground and the background, or the sky, and it draws a lot of attention. Like it's a big element in the photo, and it kind of distracts from Thorswell. So in this case, from Naste Point Lighthouse in Scotland. This is the classic view of the lighthouse here and the peninsula here, where you can walk down. In all photos, because you are standing here, the horizon lines up with the cliff up here, which creates a lot of visual tension. And that is not really something you want. It distracts from the lighthouse, which is the main subject of the photo. So when I took this photo, I decided to go down as to break the horizon of the cliff, so as it doesn't distract so much from the lighthouse as the upper perspective does. And that is what you really need to be aware of. And it's the same when you take portrait photos. You don't want the horizon line to line up with the upper part of a subject's head, or make the horizon line go through the subject's head or throat. Put it down underneath the shoulders. It looks way better. So here's another example from Lake District. We found this jetty, and we have these wooden pillars standing along the jetty, and I deliberately decided to break the horizon line here in the background. It's not really the horizon line, it's just the edge of the lake, but it has the same effect as a horizon line. So I decided to break that line with the pillars here, as to create some kind of bridge between the foreground, or the lower part of the photo, and the upper part of the photo, which is this very dramatic sky. So here's another example. I stumbled upon this location by sheer accident when we were driving through Scotland, and I really liked this very simple scene. In this case, we have two strong lines. We have the line up here of the mountains, and then down here from the meadow. And the foreground here makes this bridge between the foreground, the middle ground, and the background, as to remove the attention from the two very, very strong lines that goes through the picture. And here it comes. We can't ignore the rule of thirds. And the rule of thirds is a compositional tool which probably all photographers know about, but it's a crap tool. The best you can do is actually to unlearn the rule of thirds. But if you want to use the rule of thirds in your work, there's a few things you need to be aware of. Now, the first thing you need to know is that you don't need to put your subject in either the lower left or lower right or upper left or upper right intersection between these lines. You can also put them along the lines. So here I'm actually using the rule of thirds to make this very simple composition. And same goes for here, even though it is also a very central composition and I have other kinds of visual elements in the photo. I have here put the horizon line, which is broken, in the upper third line of the photo. Now the thing is, putting your object in the lower third of the photo does not make you home free with a brilliant photo. That's not how it works. Now, how could I actually up this picture in regard to the rule of thirds? Well, I have a cloud up here. I so wish that that cloud wasn't up here, but maybe in the upper left section of the rule of thirds, as to balance the picture properly, which was what I talked about in my first top 5 tips for compositional rules. It's balance, and balance is way more important than the rule of thirds. You can combine them and make a bit stronger composition. Now in this case with the tree in Scotland, here I have actually balanced it up. We have the tree going along the right line of the photo, and then in the upper left intersection point, which is probably up here, but we just put it down here. You don't have to follow them exactly. I have this very bright part of the photo, which were also a tip I talked about in the last video. So I am actually balancing out this point of interest with this point of interest and even the small trees down here. So we keep the balance even though I am using the rule of thirds. Same goes with this one photo here. In the upper right and lower left, I have this, one would say, interaction between Kirkjufellsfoss and Mount Kirkjufell. And that is also an important thing to have in mind. And that is also an important thing to have in mind when you're using the rule of thirds. There has to be some kind of relation between the objects you use in your photos. So let's say here, I have this line of photographers in the lower third of the photo, and I have these hills and trees which comes out of the fog in the upper third line of the photo. And what makes this photo work is that interaction from the photographers here in the foreground to this line in the background. Like there's a story here, there's something happening in the photo. Using the rule of thirds is simply just a visual tool which should emphasize your story. You can't just place the elements of your photo on those intersection points or along the lines and think you're home free. That's not how it works. So the same goes for this one photo. Again, I have actually not put my points of interest directly on the intersection points. I have actually moved the church a bit closer to the middle and myself a bit further out towards the edge, as to keep the visual balance of the photo. And it is in the interaction between me here, the silhouette, and the church that the story appears. So again, if this was, I don't know, a bell tower or a lighthouse or what do I know, it wouldn't create the same story at all. It would be hard to interpret what is going on in the photo. Here, obviously, as I've already presented, it's a person who is losing his religion, and the tonality and so forth helps to create the mood in the photo. So the very last tip is to keep it simple. So here's a very simple composition of Half Dome in the background in Yosemite Valley, and we're having the moonbeams throwing its light in here, so we can just see the silhouette. There are not many distracting elements here. The small lights here are climbers. I could remove them to make the photo even more simple, but in this case I would argue that the lights adds to the photo. and the story of the photo. Again here, very, very simple picture of Glencoe. There are not many distracting elements. We know where to look. We immediately go to this big bright section here, and then maybe down here to this little reflective light here and the road. And we just stick here. It's almost like so simple that it's an abstract. The same goes for this photo of Hyphos, which is basically just a white straight line of the waterfall surrounded by blacks, which makes it very, very simple. Again, there are no distracting elements. Besides, we can just see the mountain walls here and see the basalt, which again I would argue adds to the fact that this is a landscape photo, but it's almost an abstract, and your eyes just goes to the waterfall and then it starts exploring the surroundings a little bit. But a very, very simple and very, very strong composition. So here, from the exact same waterfall, I've just zoomed out a little bit. Now you can see this is a way more complex scene, a way more complex photo. It's still very simple, but it's not as simple as this one. Again, there are only a very few elements and not many distracting light points all over the place. Now, when you compare to this one, which is weirdly enough one of my absolute most popular photos on Instagram, but my theory is it's because it pops so much that people can't ignore it and they just tap like on it. But when you compare to this one photo, which is way more pleasant to look at than this big mesh of colors. Yes, it's an amazing scene. Definitely, it was amazing standing there and seeing how the sun was lighting up the clouds from underneath while it was rising. So if you compare to this one photo here, I've actually removed the eyes down here, but I need this eyes as a visual balance to the bright point up here. So I have so many elements going on in this picture that it gets a bit like unease, a bit disturbing compared to the other two images, which I would argue are way stronger because they are so much more simple and pleasant to look at compared to this one photo. And this one photo again of the black church in Iceland, very, very simple. And if you compare to the before, you can see how I have removed the flagpole here and the entrance here, because they don't add to the story, they don't add to the scene at all. If I had them here, they would be very, very distracting and my eyes would go over there. Here, I just put all emphasis on the church and the lines through the photo. So the 5 tips: create depth, apply scale, break the horizon. There's way more to and beyond the rule of thirds, and keep it simple. I know these tips were a bit more complex than in the previous video and it took me a little longer to explain it, but I hope you learned something from it. As always, I would highly appreciate both a like and a comment.